Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Tracy Siska. I'm Executive Director of the Chicago Justice Project. Welcome to our Facebook Live interview series. Today, we have as our guest Sharon Fairley, who's a professor from practice at the University of Chicago Law School. She's also a former federal prosecutor and former chief administrator at the Civilian Office of Police Accountability, and previous to that, the Independent Police Review Authority. Sharon, thank you so much for joining us today.
Happy to be here. Happy to be here.
So one of the reasons, besides her vast experience in police accountability, specifically in Chicago, I also wanted to talk to Sharon because of a op-ed or commentary she just published or had published in the Chicago Tribune, which is titled Police Reform Steps That Must Be Taken Immediately in Chicago. So before we get exactly to her recommendations, and we're going to talk a little bit about defunding the police and what that means and what that could look like, in front end versus back end. But I do want to first start out with and get her comments about some of the reforms announced, I guess, by Mayor Lightfoot in the first 90 days. So she came on to a couple of different ones. One is about increasing better training and getting the community involved in the academy and bringing them in so that cadets will get a better understanding of the history of the communities and who are living in the communities they're patrolling. What are your feelings on that as one of the first recommendations?
So I think that's a really important idea. I mean, training is just one of the biggest themes and one of the biggest goals for reform here. There's a lot in the consent decree about what needs to happen with training. Training is one of the reasons I believe why the department sort of fell behind, is because training was kind of an afterthought for decades, really. And particularly emphasis on training that involves the community. I think that's just a really big opportunity. We see that having a lot of success in other jurisdictions. And so I would definitely support trying that here.
Okay, I've always been bothered by, and I've had some officers talk to me, and I want your comments on it because it's on the subject of training. There wasn't, at least in the police accountability report and what I hear from officers, there wasn't mandatory retraining or mandatory training every year for officers. And I have some friends on the job in Chicago, and one of them commented to me, he's like, I don't understand why we're not like the FBI. He goes, I've worked with them on some of the teams I've been on, and from what they tell me, they get mandatory use of force refreshers every year. And he thinks that's part of the reason. He thinks there's a fear within the department by officers to actually physically put their hands on anyone now, because especially as they get further and further away from the academy, because they're not getting refreshers in that. And he thinks that leads to bad situations. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think so. The use of force training is really a huge, huge priority. And it's the fact that it's necessary and also the nature of it. So if you think about it, when you have these critical incidents as they happen, these street level encounters, they happen very quickly. And officers have to react in very changing and intense circumstances. And that requires skills that are kept up. And if you don't keep up those skills in terms of how to react in the right way, then that's when bad things can happen. And so the idea that officers could sort of leave the training academy after they've gone through the first time and never come back to work on those skills, that's part of why we're having the problems that we're having. So now, really, what's really kind of state of the art is scenario-based training, like not just like sitting in front of a PowerPoint screen, but actually having officers train on different kinds of scenarios so that they learn how to react in the right manner. So this is really an important part of what's got to happen.
So, and that leads us, we're going to go down the training rabbit hole for a minute.
Sure.
I've been supportive, personally, that when Mayor Lightfoot or others or Rahm Emanuel came out and said we need a new police academy, I know there's protests against investing anything, and I understand those arguments about for investing anything in policing. I think it's partially a missed opportunity by reformers and critics of the department and communities to not first of all, build them a new academy, because I do think the academy's facilities are not what they need to be to train a professional 21st century force, but also with that, to not mandate not only really revolutionizing the training, but also higher standards for accountability on the street should go hand in hand. If we're going to invest in this training, 150 million dollars, then there ought to be really significant increases in the standards for which we're going to hold you now that we're giving you this new training.
Yeah, so I know there's been this debate about, the investment in the training academy, but I agree with exactly what you said, Tracy, is that the facility that currently exists is woefully inadequate and not anywhere near, what's state of the art. This is the second largest police department in the country, and we should have best in class everything. And so that takes money. Now, whether that is worthy of a $95 million investment, I can't answer that question, right? Mm-hmm. I don't know what is the appropriate amount to invest that makes sense relatively to all the other issues where we could invest our money as a community. But it is an important thing to bring the facility up to date. And I hear what you're saying about, well, if we're going to give them this resource, then we're going to expect them to actually, use the skills in the way that they're trained. And accountability to me is really the biggest theme of reform. It's been historically the challenge of the department for decades, right? I mean, if you go back literally to 1904, the early 1900s, there's tons of documentation of disciplinary issues at the department, and those carry through all through the 19th century, as we know. So, looking at where we are now, it's really helpful to sort of go back and see kind of how we got to where we are today, right? And accountability is a big part of that issue.
I couldn't agree more with you said about the history. I know when under Jody Weiss, he wanted to bring in M4 assault rifles, and we met with him. I was part of a coalition that met with him, and we met with you while you were head of IPRA. And we met with Jody Weiss, and I asked them one question. I said, at one point, we met with a bunch of his deputies. At one point, you had shotguns in the car. Does anyone in this room know why you took shotguns out? And a couple of his officers got ferociously upset with me. Mm-hmm. And one of the people from the academy didn't, and I know why he didn't, because he authored a letter to Jody Weiss begging him not to put assault rifles in, and to give him, if he were going to do it, give them a year to develop the training. So there was one officer in that room who did not, but they were ferociously like, what does that mean? What does that have to do with anything? I'm like, well, if you're going to increase the firepower you're giving average officers, you'd think you'd want to learn from the last time you did it. And obviously something went wrong because you took the shotguns out of the cars. Mm. You would like to know why. And they seemed completely not only oblivious, but could not care less about learning what they had previously happened in the department.
Yeah, well, the whole concept of the militarization of the police, right? I mean, that's just, that happened, right? I mean, that's not just here, that's everywhere across the country. We have this trend in the 60s and 70s where we just continue to sort of create this militaristic environment and structure by adopting these kinds of weapons, but also just the mentality, which created this kind of us versus them mentality. And it sort of dovetails with the idea of why we're having problems with use of force, right? Because what do military guys do, right? They're allowed to do violence, right? That's their job, right? And so by creating this sort of militaristic culture, it's created part of the problems that we have today in terms of the way policing is being conducted, and why people are feeling over-policed.
So we're going to move on to two. In the coverage, Lightfoot has them connected, and maybe they are connected, but I want to talk on them a little bit separately. And that's she talks about implementing a wellness program for officers, and then connects that to an early intervention system. And I've been fully in favor of an early warning. I mean, I guess she calls it early intervention system, but the language nationally, I think that's more for PR, but the language nationally in the police accountability system is an early warning system.
Correct.
And I guess we can talk about them together. I don't think officers understand. I see the Jason Van Dyke and the murder of Laquan McDonald. I see that as a failure of the police department. Not just in the cover up, but the fact that he had 27 complaints that we know of. I think there's a 5-year gap in a time period when we don't know if he had any more complaints. And there was never really an intervention done to figure out why he was accumulating all those complaints and see if they could do anything, like if that was heading on a trajectory towards disaster.
Sure.
And I think those types of things, that's why I'm in favor of an early warning system. And I guess Lightfoot's right, tying it to the wellness program. But I think, I would bet, my bet is the FOP is going to, the police union is going to be completely against this idea. But I think I don't think they think about it right. I think there's really an opportunity with things like this to maybe have an intervention that isn't punitive, that's helpful, that maybe saves us an incident and saves that officer's career, and in Jason Van Dyke's life right now, his freedom. So have you talk about those two things a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, no, I'm definitely in support of an early warning system or an early intervention system. I think it's really important to help, and like you said, to try to kind of help those officers who are starting down the wrong path and give them the right training that can help them sort of reel them back in. A lot of what we're dealing with, I think, Tracy, are there are results of the culture of the organization. And it's a culture that has evolved over decades, as I mentioned, and it's going to be hard to change that culture overnight. We're talking about an organization of 13,000 people. And so we have to do things like have an early warning system to help to sort of help, address these cultural deficits where we can find them and really work to do it. The other thing that's really important, though, obviously, is a very effective and consistently effective accountability system. And that's part of what's been missing as well, which is why we're having the problems that we're having.
Let's talk a little bit about the culture, because you brought it up. I have another friend on the force, and I met him for a drink, and one of his buddies came from the department, and I asked him what he did, and he goes, I do paperwork. I'm like, what? He goes, I'm so sick of dealing with bosses that have no idea how to manage anything. And they're there because they know someone, not because of their experience. So it's not like I can go to them and ask them questions or learn from them. That I'd rather I'm going to serve my time off the street filing paper. I'm not going to risk my life for these guys who have mostly men, who have no idea what they're doing. And so I think that breeds into this, the parts of the problems with the culture is that a lot of the force, like especially the patrol division of the department, they don't have a lot of faith in their bosses and in management. And it's hard. I used to say about the PhD, the closer you get to it and the more you see some of the real research that some of the professors who were teaching you do, and you see that it's not of the quality you thought it was, the more disdain you have for the degree, unfortunately. And I think that's a problem with the police also, is that they see promotions from people and clout promotions and this merit list, and they see people that have risen because of connections, and they don't take them as credible leaders. Do you think that's a problem?
I mean, I think that could be part of it. And, when I think of culture, and, it really comes from the top down. And so that's why, we're in a period where we really need leadership who can step up to the plate and walk the walk and talk the talk. Because if you have, you can have a great superintendent, right, that's all committed to reform. But if his next level down, are a bunch of commanders who are rolling their eyes saying this is all BS, when we talk about reform is going to go nowhere. So we need the culture to start at the top and then really filter down so that, officers are being held accountable, at all levels throughout the organization. And that's going to take a lot of work on the part of the new superintendent and the leadership team that he puts together.
Yeah, I'm very curious to see who that leadership team that he constructs around him is. I remember when Jody Weiss came in, he pretty much cleared the management team out, and it ruffled unbelievable amount of feathers. It also, I think, ruffled in conversations. I think Mayor Lightfoot thought some of that was a mistake, but I saw it as, how can you come in and be trying to change the culture if you're going to leave in all the people that most of the people in the department don't have respect for at those levels.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
okay, so what do you see as the benefits to a wellness program for the officers? Because there's a lot of talk about that what they have to see every day and how that impacts them and
Sure.
results in bad things down the road.
Yeah. It's a hard job. There's no, I mean, there's no other way to describe it. It's a very intense, hard job. And they do, they're under a lot of stress, when they're out on the street, and they see a lot. I mean, I spent 2 years working on police accountability and, reviewing, cases, and it took a toll on me, emotionally and physically, being involved in that space. And so I get that. And so I think, when we talk about, police reform and getting the department operating in a way that we as a community think is healthy and productive, that includes supporting them and, giving them the training and the resources for them to be able to do their jobs well, right? And so we also want to create a department. We want to attract the right kinds of people into this work. And so that means that we should have programs that support them and give them the skills and support and resources that they need to stay healthy and to be able to do the job well. I think wellness is a big part of that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that wholeheartedly. The next couple issues that Mayor Lightfoot brings up is things that I've never understood, especially the first one, why it wasn't mandated to every officer and it was optional. And I've been told all along it was strictly a financial reason. But Mayor Lightfoot talks about mandatory crisis intervention training.
Right.
And I have never understood. I was in meetings with Jody Weiss and McCarthy through the coalition I was part of. And we would talk to them about that. In the department, we talked to a head of internal affairs, and they would always brag. They thought they were bragging about the number when they were able to say, well, 1,500 of the 13,000 officers have crisis intervention training.
Right. So this has been an important topic for a while. And the reason is because if you look at the percentage of, calls for police service, there's a very, very significant percentage that involve individuals in mental health crisis. And we've seen all too often how those encounters, once the police show up, can go off the rails, right? Someone calls to say, my mother, my brother, sister, you name it, is having some trouble. Can you just help me? Can you just come and help me get them, to the hospital where they can be treated? And then someone ends up getting hurt, shot or, hurt. And it's just happened all too often. So, crisis intervention, the theory behind it, the programming behind it has been, tested and proven time and time again. And so it's a doctrine of policing that we know is important and works. And so we want people to be trained on it. When they first brought the program out, it was voluntary, right? And the reason they made it voluntary is because they thought, well, we want the officers who really believe in this to be the ones who get the training, because, it's kind of, if you force it down everybody's throats, then, maybe they're not really going to really accept these ideals. And that's kind of silly in my estimation, because, you do need to train officers how to react to these situations. You need officers who understand, for example, that a person who's in mental health crisis may not be able to interpret the directions that an officer is giving them, right? Or may not be able to comply with direction that an officer is being given them because of what they're experiencing, and that they're not being non-responsive because they're being belligerent, but because they are in a mental health crisis. So we need to give that officers that kind of exposure to those kinds of concepts. And also we need it reflected throughout the system. Like if you may recall what happened with the Quintonio Legrier incident.
Yep.
Right. So here we have an individual who, we have the benefit of hindsight now. We know he was in mental health crisis, but there were 3 calls made to 911, right, where it became clear, at least in my view, that there was something going on there, that the dispatcher could have taken that information and relayed that information to the officers who were responding to that incident so that they would be aware and be prepared, more or better prepared to deal with what they might encounter. Right. And so this is a really important aspect of the system that we've got to now push out through everywhere. And then also another trend that we're seeing, which is, I think, really important and a good thing that the department has done, is that in their most recent use of force policies, they're actually giving some specific guidance in the use of force policy about dealing with people in mental health crisis. And we're starting to see that pop up in use of force policies in other jurisdictions as well. This is a very good development in my view.
Yeah, we had on the show last week Barry Friedman from the Policing Project
Sure,
at NYU Law. And he wrote a great article about disaggregating all the police functions and questioning and like forcing in questioning. Are the police the best people to do this? Because let's be honest, I'm sure you know through your work, we leave way too many things. We lay too many things at the feet of the police and say, settle this.
Right.
We cut all our schools. We cut our mental health clinics. There's no jobs. There's rampant intergenerational poverty. Take care of that. Make sure everyone stays safe and there's no violence or drug dealing. To me, it's just where I think in a lot of those situations, we're setting up the police department as a whole just to fail from the start. But he brings up a point about, especially around mental health, responding to mental health issues, is that sometimes, depending on the call, where there isn't an immediate notice of violence, that maybe a guy with a gun being the first person to that door, or a person with a gun, the first person to that door in a uniform, is not the best response. And maybe there are ways that we could stand up other social services. And this is, we're not going to go down the rabbit hole at the moment about defunding the police, but whether or not I'm not sure if the officers are going to accept it, but it's quite possible we're setting them up on a lot of these calls for mental health issues to fail, because the very presence of them in the uniform and the gun provokes violence rather than calming the situation.
Yeah, and so I think that this is a really interesting area that, we're seeing a lot of exploration right now. So there are communities who've actually tried this, right? So when you think about when people say abolish the police, right, or defund the police, there are communities that have tried to create this sort of alternative response system, right, to specifically address individuals in mental health crisis, where instead of calling 911, where you get somebody showing up with a gun, you get this group of trained crisis response people, mental health professionals, members of the community who have been trained on how to respond to these incidents, and finding that the outcomes are much better, right? And so I think this is a really great area of exploration right now, and definitely something that we should be thinking about here in Chicago.
Yeah, I have. We argued with the department and its leaders that we did not understand why so few officers were trained. Sources high up in the department kept telling me it's just about money. They really don't want to pay the cost. And I understand. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's part of it too, because anytime you take an officer off the street to bring him in for training, and it's like a 4-week training, or no, it's a 16-hour training. That costs, right? Because then you've got to put somebody else out on the street, and maybe you have to pay them overtime. So there is a cost associated with that training. You're absolutely right.
Right. But we're, as a country, as you can see, especially right now, we're incredibly short-sighted, right? Like,
right.
I think that, the city leaderships that say, wow, we're paying out, and we have an ordinance sitting in the legislative office still that for some reason isn't making it out, about redesigning the whole legislative response to police settlements and judgments.
Yeah.
But as part of that, I think the mayor should sit down with leaders from social services and the department and say, listen, we are spending 30 or 20 or 30 or 40, $50 million a year paying out civil settlements for policing.
Right.
How can we stand up and invest in other things that might be costly right now, but in 5, 7, 8, 10 years could maybe save us $30 or $40 million a year? I don't think as a society, especially as a city, that we're very good at that long-term investment strategy to find solutions.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that what's encouraging to me about the dialogue that's going on about policing and investment in communities and there's a dialogue that's happening in cities across the country right now, which is, how do we invest our community funds to most efficiently deal with the problems that we have? And sometimes it may not be necessarily investing more in policing, right? And so even our very own University of Chicago Crime Lab, based on their research, they have shown that to deal with the violent crime problem, maybe you don't invest more dollars in police, but the investment in education, job programs, and other social wraparound services, maybe those are actually better investments in terms of helping to reduce the violent crime problem we have. And so we need to start having these conversations and also trying to be more evidence-based about how we're investing our resources. So when we were just talking about the whole thing about, mental health, right? So I think part of the problem, why we started to have sort of a problem with it, is we know the mental health hospitals in the city, there were so many that were shut down. There were so few that were able to take individuals in crisis when police got them, that the police were like, they would have to sit and wait for hours while someone was being, going through intake to the hospital. And so they'd rather just take the person to jail, because then, they take them, they drop them off, and they're done with it, right? And so it just created this, crazy problem. And so maybe what we need to do is, instead of investing more money in police that can get people in mental health crisis off the street, we invest more in our mental health system, right? And that may be a better way of taking care of the problem. So we need to start having these conversations and trying to understand, what's really working. Where can we learn from other cities who have tried different things and can apply some of those learnings and test our way into figuring out what's the best way to invest in our community.
Yeah, I never understood. I mean, I thought it was completely short-sighted. When Mayor Daley closed those mental health clinics, it was such a bad idea that a police blog, which I will not mention, but I'm sure you know well, even said, "What are you doing?
Right.
You have just devastated. You have set us up for failure. You have devastated our work environment. You shouldn't be cutting it. You should be adding to it. Now all of this is you're leaving this all at our feet." And I thought, wow, that's my political views and their political views matching up on something. It must be a really bad idea to do this. And honestly, I think that we could probably do some research and tie what we're dealing with today to decisions around that, and closing all kinds of social resources, social institutions in those very same communities.
Yeah.
I don't understand how we expect people who are unfortunately living in such poverty and then dealing with mental health issues, and they're supposed to go across the city to get treatment. It would seem to me it's all in our interest to have community-based treatment available to them on a on-call basis.
Sure.
But that's just my feelings. Okay, the last recommendation from Mayor Lightfoot, I think is more filled with rhetoric than actually defined well. And I'm going to read it as she was quoted: "Establishing a new recruit program on police community relations and community policing with views from the community about what works." The views with the community about what works, I like that idea, although their views can somehow be out of line with what the science actually shows because they may have had a bad experience or something. But I really think we need to come with a firm definition of what community policing is, right?
Yeah.
Because there's view in the 90s when it was established in early 2000s, wow, community policing really changed Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
Well, before it started, violence was going down 3 or 4% a year nationwide.
Right.
And then once it was started, it continued right up until around 2015. And I don't think there's any evidence to prove, since it was a nationwide event and community policing was centrally focused in Chicago, that community policing had anything to do with it. We're doing research and we'll release something later this summer about how few people were actually involved in community policing in Chicago. So that's my riff on community policing. When you hear that, I'm all for the new community recruit program and police community relations. I think that's great. But what does community policing mean to you? You've been involved in the system for some time.
Yeah, well, I mean, community policing, there's a sort of the sort of academic view of what it is. And, there's certain components where, it's about community and police coming together to problem solve, right? To identify problems and then identify solutions together, right? Is part of the concept. And then it's also part about sort of, having this general understanding between officers and the community. I think that, and community policing is, one of the big themes in the consent decree, by the way. And so there are all these steps that, the department is making to sort of get back towards this sort of programmatic view where the idea of community policing is not just sort of a single program that the department operates, but it's more of a philosophy that sort of is imbued through the department's entire way of operating. So that's really, one thought. But, I think what the mayor is referring to is creating at least part of, a module or program within the initial training that officers receive before they're sent out into the street, that introduces them to the ideas of community policing and introduces them to members of the community that they're going to be serving, and letting those people have a dialogue to start to get familiar with each other. I mean, it's part of the problem, I think, is we're sending recruits out, into communities that they're not familiar with, into cultures that they're not familiar with. And I think what the mayor is trying to recommend is something to help try to bridge that, to at least give them, while they're at the academy, some exposure to the community that they're going to be serving, so that they can hear how that community wants to be policed. And then I think that could be very helpful.
Okay, that interaction, as you phrase it and frame it, I really love that idea. And I think there should be, when they get to the district, when the recruits get out of the academy and they get to their district, there should be a introduction to the district and the communities that they're serving, because districts are kind of big at times, and they can serve different communities. Sure. And they can be socially, economically different, even if they are racially homogenous. So that I love. So we're going to turn to some of your recommendations in your commentary. And the first one I have very strong feelings on.
Okay.
I know before you came, and while Scott Ando was working for Alana Rosenzweig as like deputy chief, or whatever his exact phrase was, I had a long phone conversation with him. And I was imploring him to do more pattern and practice stuff, that they were missing the forest for the trees on solely investigating, focused on the individual complaint, that there was all kinds of meaningful analysis that could be done, that could be very educational and make the system a learning system, and could lead to policy and practice changes. And our call turned he was very unhappy and did not like my suggestions. He was very happy just in investigating the solo complaints, and as if they weren't part of a larger system or unit or district, which I found pretty appalling. Not as appalling as him being named director, a chief administrator, by a community-led group that Ron picked. Now, one of those members is an alderman, so we'd have to question that a little bit, even though I like Michael very much. But you talk about how COPA needs to do pattern and practice investigations. And I will say, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, and I'm not sure this has gone public, but I was part of the group of concerned citizens and organizations that helped write the COPA ordinance. That's created COPA and the Deputy Inspector General for Public Safety, which I did not want in the Inspector General's office, but that's a whole nother argument. We'll get to that later, maybe when you're up here for the third time. But what I learned subsequent to the new COPA head coming in was that, and I don't remember her name, and I apologize, I should know it.
Cindy Roberts
coming in. She had conversations with the Inspector General, Joe Ferguson, and she agreed to not do pattern and practice investigations, even though we directly wrote it into the legislation that COPA would have that power. They'd entered into some agreement that just would leave that power with the Inspector General's office and the office of the Deputy Public Safety Inspector General. So I just wanted to say that because I wanted that out for people to know, because we were very bothered by it. I mean, the Chicago Coalition for Police Accountability was very unhappy with that. We thought, and I think if they wanted to cooperate in that investigation, that would be fine. But it would seem to me that COPA would want to use that data they would uncover in those to help inform their investigations on individual complaints against officers. So I just want your feeling. Why do you think it's important for COPA to have that or use that power that they have?
Well, first of all, like, if that's actually true, what you said, I'm appalled by that, because I fought really hard to get that power for COPA because I felt it was really important. And the reason why I felt that was really important is, as the chief administrator of IPRA, there were definitely times where I saw the same kind of case, the same kind of misconduct happening over and over and over again, and felt that COPA needed a way to be able to address that kind of repeated kind of misconduct, to find a way to investigate it and then come up with recommendations on how to do it. And the reason why I think that, the COPA should be able to do it is, yes, the Inspector General can do audits and review programs, but they have their own agenda. And so I felt that the COPA chief should have the power to identify these, common themes that they're seeing, and to have the power to investigate and make recommendations, because that might be a priority that the COPA chief has that's not as important to the Inspector General, right? Because they have their own mission and their own priorities. And so, in the op-ed that I wrote, I specifically said there's an opportunity for COPA to conduct a pattern and practice investigation of how the department handled the protests, looking at how the department used force, which is within COPA's jurisdiction, and then policed whether or not they adhered to their own policies about how to police demonstrations, when their First Amendment issues. And so I think that is something that's within COPA's jurisdiction and they could do. Now, subsequent to that, we know that the independent monitor is going to be conducting their own investigation. So maybe will be the sufficient way to have this done, that COPA doesn't need to do it because the monitor is going to be looking at it. But it's certainly within COPA's jurisdiction to do that if they so chose. And so I feel like it's a power that they should have.
Okay, let me ask you, since we're on this topic, I have always thought that these pattern and practice type investigations should help inform future investigations of similar conduct. And I'm not exactly sure how, but it would seem to me that if you find a particular type of misconduct around a special team, like, I guess there's talk about putting more citywide, but sort of community policing, sort of enforcement, roving units back together. But when there was SOS, the Special Operations Section, or the Targeted Response Unit, or the Deployment Operations Centers, it would seem to me that after 7 or 8 complaints from the same unit as they're roving across the city of the same type of misconduct, whatever that be, misuse of the baton, whatever it would be, and it's all consistent, and then you do an investigation to prove that, and then when you get complaint 10, 12, 14, 18, and 20, that type of pattern and practice should help inform your findings when you're in the future solitary investigations of that misconduct. What do you think of that idea? Am I missing something?
Yeah, well, I think that you're right in that, if you've conducted a pattern and practice investigation, you're going to learn a lot of things, right? You're going to learn facts that may be relevant to a specific case that you find later, such as whether or not the officer was aware that he was not supposed to do that, or connections between officers that exist that are being denied in a case that you see later. So there's lots of sources of sort of information of evidentiary value that could come from that kind of investigation that might be helpful in a future inquiry. So I see the value of that.
Okay, well, that's good. We agree again.
Yeah.
So the next thing you turn to in your op-ed is the Inspector General or the Deputy Public Safety Inspector General doing audits of body cam footage.
Yes.
So why did you specifically bring that up?
Well, I mean, I think that we all saw a lot of concerning things happening over during the course of the protests as they were happening. And so um, we all also know that many times complaints are not filed when someone is the subject of excessive force. They don't bother to file a complaint. So if we've had an incident and no one files a complaint, then there's no way that that's going to be brought to the attention of the people who can investigate that. And so that's why I thought an audit of the body camera footage could be helpful, is to just look to make sure that, number one, officers were reporting their uses of force accurately, the way that they should, right? And also just to see how much force was used and whether the policies were adhered to. So I think that there could be value to that.
I agree with that also. All right, so we're going to turn, or no, let's go next to the Illinois Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights.
Yes.
How would you change that wonderful, incredibly awesome state legislation?
Right. So, when a lot of states have these, right? There's probably, I don't know, 14, 16, somewhere around that, states that have these state statutes that provide some due process rights to law enforcement when it comes to disciplinary investigations and disciplinary matters. And I think that they kind of arose in the 1970s. A lot of the time we see comparable sort of collective bargaining agreement provisions too. So the idea is that, officers deserve some due process. And so we want to create some structure around that. But the problem is they obviously become a big hindrance to accountability. And so here in Illinois, I would point to a few of the key most problematic provisions. So the first thing is the requirement that an officer cannot be investigated for a complaint unless the complaint is sworn, signed. So this is what's called the affidavit requirement.
Yes.
We also see that reflected in the collective bargaining agreements between the city of Chicago and the police unions for Chicago. And so the fact that affidavit requirement is grounded in state law, I think it makes it a more difficult issue for the city to bargain about. And so I'd like to see that go away. The second thing is that in the Illinois statute, there is a 5-year statute of limitations for complaints of excessive force. So meaning if there's an officer involved shooting where someone, even where there was a fatality, if the city does not prosecute the officer for that incident within 5 years, the most they can do is impose a 30-day suspension on the officer. They can't fire them, for example. And so we know that, IPRA had a lot of problems with the timeliness of their investigations. And sometimes they would just blow through this 5 years. And then all you could do is punish the officer with this 30-day suspension. And so that's a problem. I think it should go away, particularly anytime there's been force used that's resulted in serious injury or death. So that's a problem as well. I would like to see that go away.
Okay, let's talk a little more in depth about this affidavit rule, as it's colloquially known. I've had one of my sources that was the highest up in the department. We talked about, and he's also an academic. He does academic research. And, I brought up the affidavit rule and he goes, no, it's awful. And he's very, very pro-police, very pro-police. And he said, no, it's awful. And I said, wow, that's interesting because I hate it too, but why do you hate it? And he goes, because it stops us from gathering data about what's going on. And we as a police department, and they didn't have an early warning system at that time, to be honest with you. They had gotten rid of it many, many years before. They had actually had one for a very short period of time I think it was called Brainmaker, if I'm not mistaken. The union forced the actual deletion of it. But he's like, no, even if we had it would so help inform an early warning system, because even if the people aren't going to cooperate, just gathering the data about the complaints and us being able to look into them and investigate them, even if it doesn't come to a sustained finding, just having that data is going to help inform the system. So he was completely against it. And I found that to be an interesting view. I don't think, well, let me ask you this. I've rambled about that. Let me ask you, how big of an impediment do you view the FOP and the police union contract? Is there, is there a back end accountability system that can be built to do what we all want it to do if the FOP contract is still in place?
So there are a number of provisions in the CBAs that are, definitely not helpful when it comes to accountability, right? And so there's just, and many of these things have been talked about. Of course, Mayor Lightfoot in her task force report pointed out, several of the top most problematic ones. So these include the fact that, when an officer is interviewed about during a disciplinary investigation, he has to be told in advance who the complainant is and what the nature of the complaint is. So of course that gives him a heads up with what, gives him an opportunity to get his story straight. Then of course, we have the affidavit requirement with the override provision, but that's a problem. Then we have the provision that says, look, before you can charge an officer with a Rule 14 violation, which is not being truthful or making a false statement, he has to have the opportunity to look at the video and then go back and change his statement, right? And so that of course is a problem. There's also the provision that says an officer involved in a shooting incident can't be interviewed until within the first 24 hours. So again, that gives the officer time to sort of work through a statement. In the meantime, they're perfectly able to talk to their union representatives, right? Who may be also talking to the other involved officers, right? So there are a number of problematic, provisions that, I think that the city is going to try to negotiate around, but it's going to be a negotiation.
Okay, so we're going to talk about one more statewide issue, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about defunding the police. I have a definition of that I prefer, and it's not the hysterical one. I think we need to get rid of some of the hysterics around the whole discussion because I think that's not productive. What are your feelings on licensing police officers? I know that's been brought up, and I think for Chicagoans, I'm not sure what impact that would have because I don't see there was a big problem with Chicago hiring officers from other jurisdictions that had problems that may not be able to get hired if they were licensed and lost their license. It may help other jurisdictions out of Chicago because officers that had a problem in Chicago and then were on their way to being disciplined and resigned or retired and then go get a job somewhere else, maybe by them being found losing their license because of what happened in Chicago, they can't get a job somewhere else. But I have questions about how effective that's going to be as far as accountability in Chicago. So I just want to know your feelings about it.
Yeah, so this is a topic that's come up. I'm definitely a proponent of trying to explore some reform here. The system that we have now, right, is officers have to have state certification, and there are certain circumstances through which they can lose their state certification, meaning they cannot be a sworn officer anywhere in the state. But those circumstances are very, very narrowly defined, right? So if you have a felony conviction and certain kinds of misdemeanor convictions, then you could lose your state certification. And so, we all know that sometimes, particularly when it comes to use of force incidents, it is exceedingly difficult to sustain a criminal conviction. They are so rare, right? Because there's a lot of reasons for that, right? These cases are hard to start with. The criminal standard beyond a reasonable doubt is really hard. There's a lot of reasons for that. So there may be circumstances where we really are uncomfortable with the way an officer has conducted themselves and really don't want them being a policeman anymore, but we cannot take their certification away because it doesn't fit this particular rubric and that's in the current state statute. So this is definitely an area that I've been working on with some of my other colleagues at the law school and some other subject matter experts who are concerned about this as an issue.
Okay, I want to offer a suggestion to the licensing.
Sure.
I think, especially if you look at the Laquan McDonald case, or if you look at the Kochman case with Daley's nephews, both of which resulted, by the way, in Inspector General's investigations. I think if we're going to license officers, I think we need to do something about the retirement, what I call bailout, which means you got your 20 in, and the day things turn sour on you, you just leave and you're completely immune from the police accountability systems grasp. And I think that needs to change. You're getting a pension that's funded a lot by taxpayer dollars. If you are at the time, I think it should be, especially for licensing, if you are the subject of an investigation pending or reasonably could see it coming, and you're collecting your pension or want to collect your pension, you have to cooperate. You have to continue cooperating in good faith with that investigation, and whatever police accountability adjudication, like for the Chicago would be the police board, that process. And if you're found guilty of what we would categorize some serious misconduct in taking part in that, you lose your license and certification and you lose your pension. Because in the Kochman case with Daley, most of those actors just retired.
Yes, it's true.
The Quan McDonald shooting, everyone through the chain that approved or did not turn in or did not say anything when they looked at that video and said it was okay, they just retired. And it's another level of not holding people accountable and saying, we always hold the bottom troops, like in the military or in policing, the bottom level people always get held to account for their misconduct. And the upper level people never do. So if I had my say in my magic wand, something around the licensing would include them having to cooperate with the accountability system after they leave. So tell me why I'm wrong.
No. I think that's a really interesting idea, because we know that this has been an issue. We've seen so many officers who get put into the accountability system, their cases up at the police board, and then they just retire. They resign or they retire, right? And then they get to keep their pension, because the pension is a completely separate issue.
It is.
And so that, looking at if there's a way to tie that to the disciplinary system, I think that's an interesting concept.
Right. I mean, it would have stopped Burge from getting his pension. Right now, the one that the anti-Lightfoot forces keep throwing up is Dante Servin.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Right. She kept letting him stay, and she let him collect his pension. And I'm like, I think all of that's bad, but she didn't let anyone do anything.
There's nothing she could do.
There was nothing they could do. There are laws. We have to follow them. If we're not going to follow them, they certainly are not.
Right.
Right. So I just think we have to find a way to end that bailout where I can just leave no matter what I've done. You're not bailing on criminal charges, but you are bailing on the entire police accountability system, and maybe keeping secrets with you as you do that. All right. So we're going to turn real quickly in the last 7 or 8 minutes we have here. Defunding the police. When I attach, and I am a kindred spirit on the idea of, at the very least, having a very serious public discussion about what a new public safety agency in the city of Chicago or any city could look like, would look like if we took Professor Friedman's roadmap and questioned every possible activity of a police officer and whether or not they're the best people to do it. And then we reconceptualized the system that developed those alternatives into our catalog of responses, and not got rid of police, but redirected some of the funding to build up those other social services and other responses, and took some of the things off their plate. And in my dream version of that, it would free us of the FOP contract, because that new public service agency would not be restricted by that. And we would have to take, I'm all for having them collectively bargain their pay and their benefits, because I want them to have that. I'm not anti that, but I'm for having that discussion. I think a little bit it was a mistake by the mayor to just dismiss it out of hat, instead of saying we're open to consider everything. They're in the middle of negotiations with the FOP. I think considering that would put pressure on those negotiations. And if you don't get anything from them, then you can maybe move in another direction. So what do you feel about the defund the police concepts and discussions?
So here's my sort of take on this, right? So I think when you look back historically here in Chicago, and also when you look across the country, figuring out what the right size of a police department is just a really complicated question.
Mm-hmm.
And it becomes too politically easy when you are in a situation where you have a violent crime problem, particularly like the very insidious one that we have here. It becomes just too easy to say, we just need more. We need more. We need more police. We need more money. It just becomes too easy, right? Because then you can say, well, here's what I've done. I've added more police. I've added more resources, right? As a city leader, you have that to fall back on, right? So now what I think is so great about the conversations that are being had is now we actually see, political leaders and communities giving more deeper thought about how do we more wisely use the resources that we have as a community to deal with the public safety needs that we have. And so these ideas of questioning, do we really need police to do that? I think is fantastic. And as I mentioned earlier, there are communities who are seeing success by trying some of these things, right? Trying to create this, crisis response group that's not police to respond to people in mental health crisis. We have, also we've got places like the Crime Lab doing research showing what if we invested more in education, if we invested more in a high school summer jobs program, those things would actually do more to help our crime problem than adding more funding to policing. So I think these are really important conversations to be had. These decisions have to be evidence-based and may not be something that we can jump into right away. We have to maybe do some trials and test our way into it. But I think it's just a really big opportunity, particularly when you hear, part of the challenge that we have here in Chicago is that we have these communities that have clearly just been over-policed, right? They've been over-policed. It's like too much. And so if we're able to dial that back, and it will also make communities feel safer. And we also know we have things like, last year, the Inspector General, did this huge report on how the department was completely overusing overtime. So, I mean, there's a lot to question in terms of how we're investing our city funds, in policing and in keeping communities safe, whether we're doing it efficiently and effectively or not. So I think these are great conversations that we need to start having. I'm excited about it.
I am too. And just to add a little context about hiring police and how easy it is. When Rahm Emanuel made that announcement in September of 2016, that the police department came to him and said they needed 1,000 more cops. Well, we've been in a FOIA battle with the police department for the analysis they did. They went to City Hall in the days after that announcement and told aldermen, we did a top to bottom analysis. We know exactly how many officers we need and we know exactly where they need to go. We are several months into a year, maybe, into litigation with the Chicago Police Department. One of those for FOIA violations, one of those things is give us that analysis. And what they're trying to tell the court is, we looked as hard as we could, Your Honor, but we just couldn't find it. And they're trying to get the judge to say, oh, okay, you looked hard enough. Not that they never did one, which I'm 99% sure they did. They didn't, right? They never did it. This was a political decision by Rahm Emanuel to commit to a little over $1 billion on the old pay scale. That's probably more now. It's a little over $1 billion to pay those officers just for the first 10 years.
Yeah.
Pay them, train them, equip them, their pensions. So I think people that are anti even having the discussion don't realize how much money we spend.
Yeah.
And I think we have to come to terms in Chicago, and the media has to do this. I don't want any person to die in Chicago. And if I could wave a magic wand and stop all the shootings and all the violence, I would do it in a heartbeat. But we have to come to terms that we have some endemic violence issues in Chicago, and that no matter how much policing we have thrown at it, the best we've had in the last 10 or 15 years is like 438 or 485 murders. That's not a success. And I think part of the problem we have in Chicago is if we try new things and there's a violent weekend like we just had a week or two ago, they all blur now, that's going to be the end, because the politicians and the media are calling for the end of the study because it isn't working.
Yeah. Well, you know what they say, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, right? And that's what we seem to be doing in terms of the way we're managing our crime problem. Yeah, I happen to think that our violent crime problem here in Chicago is really unique and different, right? I mean, I think that it's just, you know, the nature of the structure of the city, the neighborhoods of the city, it's just, you know, the systemic, you know, racism, all of it. It's just, I think it's endemic to Chicago, and we've got to figure out how to fix it. There's just no question.
I agree with that. And I would really love a war on poverty in Chicago.
Mhm.
Someone to come out and say, we're going to spend $1 billion investing in the South and West Side over the next 10 years. And let's see what the elimination of poverty on the mass scale in these communities does for public safety.
Yeah, I mean, I know that's, you know, part of the mayor's platform. And so, you know, I'm hoping that she's going to be able to make some change in that area. So
I hope so too, let me tell you. Sharon Fairley, thank you so much for spending the hour with us. We really appreciate it.
pleasure.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be up in the next few weeks. We have the next couple of weeks a discussion coming up about the Chicago police. It is not a single database. It is not a gang database. It is a variety of databases that collect information on gangs. We just had an audit of it from the Inspector General's office. We're going to talk to a community activist and a lawyer that fought to end that, even though it's only semi-ended, I guess, according to former police or Superintendent Beck. It's coming back. So we'll be talking about that. And we have other people coming on that we'll let you know through our Facebook page. Sharon, once again, thank you so much. Everyone will be back next week from 12 to 1. Thank you very much.
All right. Take care, guys.